Hello everyone, this is Philosophy of the People with Stefan Bertram and Ben Burgess. We don't know which one's which, you just have to read the text below our faces. And I am being really thrown off by the fact that Restream has redesigned the overlay and managed to I can even I like to see a lot of my own face, and now they've made it much smaller, which is really tragic for me. There's two acronyms in the piece today, which I had a particular reaction to, which may not be common. One showing just that I'm British, and the other showing that I'm severely irony poisoned. One was the fact that I read RIP and couldn't take that serious, like RIP, and I couldn't take that seriously as an actual phrase that people say because it's been abused so much online. And the other one is PAP, which is a very important acronym for today. Basically, the acronym of today. It stands for principles of. Sorry, well, I've forgotten what it stands for now.
Principles of possibilities.
Right. But in English, pap means bad or naff or a bit shit.
Well, as far as I know, Frankfurt's the one that coined the acronym, and he's arguing against it. So, even though I think he was just being insensitive to the sensibilities of our British friends, maybe he wouldn't have minded that.
He looks quite jolly in the thumbnail. Jordan asked, what do Brits call a pap smear then? I think we call it a pap smear. I mean, it's a kind of a grim idea anyway, so it's not really bad that it's not like a pap smear by absent. That is a really cool, nice thing everyone loves to do.
Fair enough.
Someone also asked, this challenge is confusing, blah, 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 basically saying, what's going on? This show is always at 9 p.m. on a Sunday, apart from the weeks where it isn't, which is
it's at 9 p.m. if you're in the 0.5% of people who are watching it from your time zone. For everybody else, it's either
right. No, as we've established in previous shows, my perception of time is objectively true. And everyone else is false.
Yeah. It's look, I'm not even going to do my time zone. I'll just say it's 4 Eastern is what it always is. Today it's 4:30 because there was some
there was some Gene not reading the chat.
I was going to try to come up with a polite euphemism for that, but yes, there was some Gene not reading the chat, and so the restream didn't get set up what it should have. And by the time it was like, oh shit, we should do this for 4:30, so we have time to post it, and people will at least have 15 minutes to become aware that it exists.
We should just change it so that I do it, because my making of it isn't as good, but also it's only 10% worse, and I have the time to just do it.
This is definitely something we should figure out on air.
Well, I will freely choose to do that in future. But Ben, you have to explain what's going on today.
Yeah. So we just finished this 2-parter on the philosophy of time. That's that's the thing from which Stefan deduced that the British Standard Time is the objective.
Well, we're plus 00. That means this is the right time.
Fair enough. And in between, so I wanted to finish that, which is why I only did this one this week. But in between part 1 and part 2 coming out, this philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, passed away. And looks like, actually, I'm not 100% sure on this, but assuming that his birthday had already passed, he was that would have made him 94. But he's somebody who I think actually retired a couple years, before I'd first heard of him, or at least retired from his active teaching job from what I saw on Wikipedia, although that's also when he started publishing some popular books. If you've ever heard of, if you I sort of say at the beginning of the essay, if you feel like maybe you've vaguely heard of this guy, but you're not quite sure from where, it's probably from his 2005 kind of philosophical coffee table book on bullshit, which is actually the essay he'd written like decades before, but came out in 2005, and it was actually a huge bestseller in 2005. It was 27 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. I can remember seeing him interviewed by Jon Stewart about it on The Daily Show and thinking, holy shit, that's Harry Frankfurt.
People in 2006 were amazed because it was the first book ever to have a swear word in the title.
More or less. So yeah, and yeah, I mean, I think that was definitely part of the appeal of On Bullshit, that sort of like very slight naughtiness of the fact that was the title, but like that it wasn't just like, you weren't just like, it wasn't just like having something in your coffee table that was like, I don't know, everything's bullshit, the Punk Rock Manifesto or something like that, right? It's like a respectable kind of
the most respectable bullshit you could make.
Exactly. And it's because, I think that sort of combination of things that was going on in that little book, that you have, that it's sort of accessible, but it's very rigorous. And there's this, very smart philosopher who is applying the tools of his trade to investigating the exact difference between lying and bullshitting, was something that obviously appealed to a lot of people. But what I really wanted to try to give people a sense of in this essay is why Frankfurt was a big deal before that to, people like us, people who like philosophy. And that is mostly about, this like kind of classic argument that he made, the sort of work that he did starting in the late 60s on something we've talked a lot about here, before, which is, free will, determinism, moral responsibility, how all these things relate to each other.
Nice. And specifically, we've defended, I guess, probably classical compatibilism on this show before, which is the idea that despite determinism, you can, you have freedom to choose between various options in at least some sense. But
yeah, so classical compatibilism, we're calling it classical compatibilism, obviously, to differentiate it from something. And the other kind of compatibilism is the Frankfurt kind of compatibilism. And, one way of thinking about the difference between the two is to sort of take a long step back and think about why anybody thinks that if everything's determined, then there's no free will. Like, why is it that people think that there would be no free will in a completely deterministic physical universe? And there are a couple reasons that people might think that, not all of which are going to be addressed by this, but probably the main one, I think it'd be fair to say, is the idea that, well, look, if everything is determined, in other words, if everything that ever happens is the only thing that could have happened given the prior links in the chain of cause and effect leading up to it, like given one complete time slice of the universe, everything that happens at one given time, future complete time slices of the universe are just baked into it, right? That there's only one, given the total state of the universe at T1, there's only one possible total state of the universe at T2. Well, given that claim, it seems to follow in a pretty straightforward way that nobody can do otherwise than what they actually do, right? That the thing that people do is, if everything is determined, including everything that happens in human brains, then what the thing that people do is the only thing that they could have done. So that'd be one premise. And then a second premise would be that if people couldn't do otherwise than what they actually did, then they're not free in the way that they'd have to be responsible for their actions. And both of those sound super duper plausible. And so you put those together, you have incompatibilism. You have the idea that there's no free will in a deterministic universe. And the classical compatibilist, and this is actually maybe worth pausing on for longer than I do in the essay, because I have been, I've actually, believe it or not, the last several essays, I've been disciplined about making sure that I never go beyond 3,000 words.
There aren't like enormous asides and so on.
Yeah, so that often entails painful cuts, but figure, okay, 3,000 words, that's like a reasonable upper limit. So one of the painful cuts today was the one where I was going to go more into classical compatibilism and why it might not be as crazy as it sounds, which, as you say, we've kind of talked about before, but it's maybe worth recapping here. But the classical compatibilist move, right? The thing that most compatibilists have done historically, like David Hume, for example, does this, is to deny premise one, to deny that if everything is determined, nobody can do otherwise. And that seems like a crazy thing to deny, because, well, what do you mean? Like, what determined means is that this is the only thing that could happen. So if everything, including all the human thoughts and actions and decisions, are determined, then what do you mean you could do otherwise? Aren't you just contradicting yourself? And I think oftentimes people hear this and they're just confused about what the classical compatibilist could even be claiming, or once they start to see what the classical compatibilist is claiming,
They say it's bullshit.
Then they say, exactly, it's bullshit. It's playing with words. It's like just it's not taking the problem seriously. It's just trying to do some sort of like fancy wordplay to like tap dance around the obvious implications of determinism for free will.
Right, and then people will say that they'll take compatibilism to be like a pragmatic thing. That we should pretend we have free will or whatever.
Exactly. This is. I think this is something actually I'll often tell intro to philosophy classes, that
I like how similar our experience, you teaching intro to philosophy and me just posting on the Reddit as philosophy is.
Yeah,
it's quite pleasant, really.
I think it is essentially variations on a theme. Like if you're sort of either way, you're kind of encountering people who are running into this stuff for the first time, and you're figuring out how to what the sort of common misunderstandings they're going to have are and how you can try to steer them around it. Yeah, I think it's it's more fun to do it in a classroom than to do it on the internet. But just by the way, why I have very mixed feelings about online teaching. But
the only teaching I got to do, apart from like 3 classes, was online teaching. And it was unpleasant.
Yeah. It basically takes away the one thing that's like actually fun and distinctive about teaching, that you wouldn't get out of like correcting people's misunderstandings on Reddit, which is the actual like classroom discussion, is just different from doing it online. But yeah, so I think oftentimes exactly what you just said. So something I'll tell intro to philosophy students when they're first like grappling with this idea is, this might be so counterintuitive to you. Your mind might so thoroughly reject it when you first hear it that you're going to be tempted to try to reinterpret it into something that like makes more sense to you. Don't do that, right? That's that. Like it's don't.
And the other one is just think that compatibilists are like saying some stuff sometimes isn't just determined maybe.
Exactly, right. That's like one of the that's probably the most common way for people to reinterpret it in their heads into something that makes more sense to them, to say, okay, so what compatibilists are saying is that some things are determined and other things are free will. Okay, that must be it, right? But no, that's what like libertarians are saying, right? Libertarians, yes. Not in the political sense, but in the free position on free will sense, right? Incompatibilists who believe we have free will. That's what they're saying, right? Like, it's not like the free will libertarian just denies that, denies that like the process by which your car breaks down is deterministic, right? Like of course they believe there's like most physical processes are either deterministic or if there's quantum randomness, whatever, might as well be.
So as was mentioned in the essay today, we talked about before, like kind of the least bad idea of libertarianism, which is based on kind of like some kind of quantum event in the brain. But that made me think back to that, and I'm like, well, why can't a squirrel have libertarian free will then? I guess
Yeah,
because it lacks other capacities, but
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think like Kane might have a way around that, but yeah, well, but certainly like if you think that the thing that's special about free will is that um, is that there is this like non-deterministic thing going on in your brain, well, hey, we have no particular reason to think that there's non-deterministic things going on in our brain, but we also have no less reason to think that there are non-deterministic things that go on in squirrels' brains. So if, this is a point that Frankfurt makes in his essay, Freedom of the Will and the Concept of a Person, Free Will and the Concept of a Person. And it's one that always stuck with me, that it's like, well, what this really shows, I think, is that this idea that like there's some sort of non-deterministic event going on, when you're, in decision-making in the human brain, it's not just that we don't need that for the kinds of free will worth caring about. It's that it wouldn't help with the kinds of free will worth caring about. Like we wouldn't think that like a squirrel that had some sort of bizarre quantum event going on in its brain when it decided, where to bury its nuts, was therefore exercising free will in the way that we think would make squirrels like responsible for their decisions and, all of that stuff. We would just find
it's a bit like the when like materialists will flip as I mentioned on one of our later shows, how some materialists will try and flip the zombies argument to show that,
yep.
To say that, if you're saying that these zombies aren't conscious but can do anything, do everything that other people can, then what's the point of this thing you call consciousness? It seems to also, when the libertarians make that kind of argument, it seems to reveal that they're talking about the wrong sort of thing. And if we don't have that thing, it doesn't seem to matter.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very similar kind of argument. It's very tempted to start talking about consciousness right now, but not today, Satan. Yeah, that is actually a very sweet comment, Dave. Yeah. So okay. So that's one way that people reinterpret compatibilism in their heads into something that makes more sense to them. Say, well, some things are determined, but other things are free. Another way that they'll sometimes do it. In fact, I think people who are not necessarily just intro students, but like who maybe have thought about this a little bit more, but especially in non-academic context, what they'll often do is they'll reinterpret it in the way that you said earlier. That they'll say, so what you're saying is that it would be like pragmatically useful to like treat people as if they were morally responsible for their actions, that treat people as if they had the right kind of control to exercise to be responsible for their actions. But again, no, it's not. In fact, that's what lots of incompatibilists would say, right? That's what lots of free will skeptics would say. Sam Harris more or less says that like, okay, I don't believe in free will, but sure, it might be like socially useful to treat people in certain contexts as if they had free will, like that's I think that's like a pretty common thing for free will skeptics to say, which is why I try to make a point when I write about this of saying objective moral responsibility, that it's not the question at stake between compatibilists and incompatibilists is not whether people are free in whatever way they, like, it's not.
Don't worry, it's not a practical question; it's a philosophy question.
Exactly. Yeah. Don't worry. This is just bullshit. Yeah. Yeah. It's not a question about whether it would be useful to act as if people were free in the way that they'd have to be responsible for their actions. The question is whether they are responsible in the way they'd have to be free in the way they'd have to be responsible for their actions. So The compatibilist claim is a really strong one. It's that no, people really objectively would be. Whether it's even useful or not is a whole separate issue, right? I mean, like it could be that it's terrible. It could be that the social consequences are really bad, which would be a tragedy. Then we'd have to decide whether to pretend like it wasn't true. But that's a separate question. The question is whether people really are free in this way. And the compatibilist claim is that yes, even in a completely deterministic universe, people would be free this way. At which point, I think once you like really drill that into people's heads, they're like, okay, then what the hell? Like, what's like, how could that possibly be? And there are at least two different strategies for making that work. The second one's going to be Frankfurt, but again, I think it is worth maybe touching more than I was able to in the essay itself on the classical compatibilist case, because even though part of the appeal of Frankfurt is, okay, well, if you don't buy the classical compatibilist argument, here's a way you can still be a compatibilist. I do still think that there is, as I say in the essay, a non-crazy case to be made for classical compatibilism. In other words, for the idea that
I hope so. I believe in
it. That even in a completely deterministic universe, there's this like important sense in which you'd be free to do otherwise. And I think one way of understanding like what the classical compatibilist is saying is it's a time when I really wish there was a whiteboard here. So I could
whiteboard.
Yeah, maybe I will. I was just saying last night that I need some, still furnishing the new apartment. Need some more stuff for the walls. So that's so maybe I will. But
I could make you big and me small.
For the whiteboard parts of the stream. But yeah, so if people could do this, like just visualize this, right? Like think about that argument that we just talked about, right? So premise one. If everything's determined, no one can ever, no one has the ability to do otherwise than what they actually do. Premise two, if no one has the ability to do otherwise than what they do, then no one is free in the way they'd have to be responsible. Conclusion, if everything's determined, nobody's free in the way they'd have to be responsible. So one way to think about this, like different ways of, it's like you think, okay, how, like if you don't buy that argument, how can you push back against it? And essentially, the classical compatibilist way of pushing back against it is by accusing it of committing the equivocation fallacy. That's when you use the same term to mean two different things in the course of an argument. That's, the silly examples would be like, I don't know, the sort of, fire trucks are red, communists are red, kind of thing, right? But, this is a more interesting example of that.
Fire trucks are red, communists are red, therefore communists are a useful force in society.
Yeah, there you go.
Invalid inference, false statement.
Yeah, there are lots of problems with that argument, even though the conclusion's good. The equivocation that the classical compatibilist is accusing the argument of is in the phrase "can do otherwise," right? So the classical compatibilist is saying that, then that's also the undistributed middle fallacy, A is B, C is B, A is, A and C can both be B without being, the same. So anyway, that's okay. So what the classical compatibilist is saying is like, okay, look, there's clearly a sense in which the first premise is true, that if everything is determined, nobody can do otherwise. There's also a sense in which the second premise is true, that if nobody can do otherwise, we're not free in the way it would have to be responsible. But the classical compatibilist wants to say it's not the same sense. That, in other words, that the sense in which you need to be able to do otherwise to be free and responsible isn't the same sense in which you couldn't do otherwise if everything's determined. So, and this sort of, again, I do acknowledge, and especially important in a Substack, that, you impose some self-discipline, do acknowledge that keeping it down to the word limit and cutting things as necessary does make the essays less digressive and better. But this one hurt because I really wanted to get into this in the essay. That, I mean, I do think, we talked about this a little bit before, that it would be a mistake to be too quick to just dismiss the idea that there's a sense in which you can do otherwise, even if everything's determined, and that might be a really important sense. Just to like dismiss that as like, oh, that's just wordplay. You're just playing with trying to carve everything up just so to jerry rig it to get the result that you want. Because if you think about non-moral can do otherwise talk, we don't typically reserve can do otherwise talk for can do otherwise given every single fact in the causal background of whatever happened, right? So I know
if I ask Ben what he could have had for breakfast,
yeah,
he's not going to say the thing he actually ate and only that. I mean, maybe he would in a particular guy if he only had that in his kitchen.
Yeah. I would say the blueberry muffin for breakfast, the coffee that I just reheated before the stream. If that muffin was literally the only thing in the kitchen, then I would say that's the only thing, and that was the only thing in the kitchen. And I don't even know
you didn't have legs to leave the house.
Yeah. I was under some sort of Chinese style lockdown in my apartment, the food delivery apps.
Or as we'll come to later, there was some kind of brain implant in your brain, which was
exactly right. These were all circumstances in which I might say that's the only thing I could have eaten. But assuming that there were like, it's like, I don't know, some like raisin bran over there on the counter and whatever, like I wouldn't say that was the only thing I could have eaten. Like unless I was like just being a silly pedant because I knew we were talking about philosophy, I wouldn't say that. If I were just talking like a normal human being, I would say, oh, I could have had the raisin bran, I could have had whatever, right? Or like, if I always think about examples like, two people are shooting hoops in the backyard, and there's and one of them misses a shot, and the other one says, oh, you could have made that, right? What they don't mean, presumably, is you could have made the shot given every single fact about where you were standing and where exactly your fingers were positioned on the ball and how much force you applied and the air pressure around it and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because if we're including all of that, right, then no, you couldn't have made it, right? Because if you include every single relevant fact, then, well, given every single relevant fact, you didn't make it. So if we're just baking all that into our you could have, then you could have made the shot is just never going to be true. Or if it is, it's true in some uninteresting quantum randomness way that is not really what anybody's talking about. So presumably what you mean when you say you could have made it is, well, given how good or bad you are at basketball and how tall you are and
I'm just imagining someone failing to make a dunk and his like bro ribbing him, and then him being like, well, actually it wasn't my fault I missed, it was due to the like particular randomness and the unfolding of the quantum way of
Yeah,
functioning.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. We mean given a bunch of interesting, relevant facts about your own abilities or lack thereof, the distance between you and the hoop, etc., you could have made it. And similar, and we wouldn't say that if the hoop was 300 feet in the air or there was a force field over it or anything like that. We'd say, yeah, you would not have been able to make it. So even if we completely believe in determinism, like it sort of feels like everybody's a classical compatibilist about missed shots. And so the classical compatibilist says, hey, maybe this can do otherwise that seems to, like, if we nod along with premise 2, we say, yeah, you have to be able to do otherwise to be in control in the right way to be responsible. Well, maybe the notion of can do otherwise that we're appealing to there is one that's like the sense in which you could have made the shot. That, like, that there are, that the sort of what we really mean is can, given certain facts about your own psychology, can, given the absence of certain mitigating facts, like, if there's somebody who, if like the presence of somebody who would coerce you into not doing otherwise.
Yeah, and like my desires and also my ability to like respond to reason.
Yeah, like, something like that.
For instance, versus Lucy.
Yes.
Me and Lucy could be said to both have desires to eat things at various points in the day. But if you gave me reasons why I shouldn't eat some delicious, tasty food which smells very good, such as it's horribly poisoned, that would work on me, but only through kind of like coercion or kind of like a could you achieve the same effect for the dog?
Yes, there is absolutely no reasoning with Lucy about why she shouldn't eat something. You have to just not let her. You can spend all the time you want explaining it, and she'll just be eating while you're talking. I think that's right. So obviously there are different flavors, but like any version of classical compatibilism is probably going to say the kinds of relevant facts we're thinking of when we say that you could have are facts that in some way or another have to do with your own psychology, or probably also facts about the absence of external constraint. There's some very simple forms of compatibilism that I think are implausible precisely because they wouldn't really differentiate between you and Lucy. They're just,
we do stuff, yo.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, you have desires and then you act on them. It's like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, we aren't constantly coerced. We aren't like literally in a cellar, like chained to a wall.
Yeah, exactly right. I think that's where. I think like some very early versions of like Hume's version and in the Liberty and Necessity chapter, the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, I think are very vulnerable to that critique, which is why you might want to flesh it out with something about the sort of.
Clearly, Hume was a secret dog freedom believer.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Actually, I don't even know if it's that secret. I think he sort of. I have to reread it now, but I think he sort of says, animals, sure, why not? But
esoteric human veganism.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so yeah, I think that's not like whether or not you ultimately think that that's true. I think that the sort of quick dismissals of it as just obviously cannot possibly be right, I think are superficial. I think that you honestly,
you certainly can't just appeal to like pure intuition to dismiss it, right? Because as we've established, the kind of the force, a large part of the force on the side of classical compatibilism is the way that everyone speaks all the time, as we talked about in our time episodes.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. Yeah, I think that there's. I think that there's like. I mean, I have argued in the past and still think right that there is that compatibilism actually does probably better capture most of our ordinary intuitive way of talking and thinking about free will, and then of course you could say, well, okay, but what kind of compatibilism? But like certainly as far as this kind of classical compatibilism we're talking about, I think that if you just say, oh, that's just wordplay, it's silly because given every single fact about the reality, you couldn't have done otherwise. I think that that's pretty implausible because I don't think that in other contexts we would assume that you need to bring every single fact on board in order to ground claims about counterfactuals about what could have happened. I think that normally we assume, in fact, the opposite. I think we assume that you have to select which ones are going to be relevant in order to even assess a counterfactual claim about what you could have done. But whether all this means that it is right, I mean, that's obviously a much bigger question. I think it's just like, if it's wrong, it's not obviously wrong in the way that people take it to be because they haven't thought about it enough. But then even if you do think it's like, whatever you think about that, right? That whole discussion has basically been about, is premise one true? Or at least, is it true in the way that it would have to be for premise two? Is it true for the same sense of ability to do otherwise that would be relevant to premise two, that would be relevant to the premise about how you need to be able to do otherwise to be responsible for your actions? And maybe it is, maybe it's not. But let's say you come to the conclusion at the end of all this that no, it's actually the classical compatibilist is wrong. That there is no compatibilist determinism sense of can do otherwise, in which would be sufficient for for the principle of alternate possibilities, for the idea that you need to be able to do otherwise to have free will, and in the sense that would matter for being able for moral responsibility. Frankfurt is going to come and say, okay, you should still be a compatibilist though. Here's why. Because Frankfurt is going to say, look, forget what, it doesn't matter whether the sense of can do otherwise that you're thinking of when you assert the principle of alternate possibilities, that you have to be able to do otherwise to be responsible. It doesn't matter whether that's a compatibilist determinism sense of can do otherwise or not, because the whole principle's bad. You should, Frankfurt thinks you should reject premise two, and that is really confusing on first contact, because think, well, hold on. It's bad enough that you're telling me that you can have free will, determinism is true, but now you're telling me that you can have free will even if you're not, even if you're not free to do otherwise, and now, like, surely,
which on the face of it could just be like an even worse version of the Humean thing, which is like you're free when you do stuff.
Yeah. You certainly don't want it to be that, right? But it's like, come on, surely you can be, you can have free will without being free to do otherwise. Surely that one's bullshit, right? I mean, like that's just some kind of weird philosopher game. What are you talking about? And that was definitely my first reaction when I first ran into Frankfurt's signature argument about this. So I can remember in the essay it was 2005. I think it was 2005, might have been 2004, but it was one of those. And I was, I was an MA student at Western Michigan, and somebody, this like brown bag lecture series did one where they talked about Frankfurt's argument, and I thought, no, that's not right. That's like, I might not have figured out where the trick is in this argument yet, but come on, there is one. Like this is some kind of sophistry, right? You cannot be right about this. And then, within a year or two, I can remember, next time I talked about it, sort of realizing that I'd switched positions. I thought, no, actually, I think he's right. Right. I think this is correct. And because, I think it sort of has this like counterintuitive friction. Oftentimes when you first hear it, but then, then I think on sort of letting it settle in the back of your mind, your mileage may vary, but, in my case, it's like, oh yeah, wait, that's actually a good point. So Frankfurt is going to argue that actually free will is ambiguous, that it can mean freedom to do otherwise, or it can mean the kind of control that we need in order to be responsible for our actions. And of course, the vast majority of everybody on all sides of the debate had previously assumed that those were one and the same thing. But Frankfurt's going to argue, no, these can come apart. These are separable. So his argument is
well, he does a lot of work with examples.
Yeah, exactly, right. So yeah, there's this whole literature on Frankfurt cases, which are basically variations on these classical examples that he gave in this paper, Moral Responsibility and Alternate Possibilities. I think it's that way around. I'm always worried that I'm saying it with the conjuncts flipped. But in that paper, he talks about these two characters, Black and Jones. Jones is the person about whom we're asking, is he responsible for his actions in different scenarios? And Black is the person who is setting things up in ways that would raise questions about whether Jones is responsible for his actions. And in the essay, I quote both the sort of very dry way that Frankfurt initially presents the example, and then I sort of give the playful way that that all the sort of more because Frankfurt is sort of giving really less an example and a sort of template for generating examples. So what Frankfurt says is, hey, there's this guy Jones, and he's either going to do what Black wants him to do or not. And if he does what Black wants him to do on his own without Black having to do anything, Black's not going to do anything. And if Jones doesn't do what Black wants him to do on his own, then Black will intervene in order to cause him to do what Black wants him to do. And he sort of says, look, whatever your theory is of what it would take to not have alternate possibilities, to not be able to do otherwise, that's what Jones would hypothetically do. And the crucial point is the case that Frankfurt really wants you to think about is a case where Jones does what he wants, does what Black wants, thus Black never has to intervene. And Jones isn't like motivated by the knowledge that Black will intervene. It's not like Black has said, hey, you better do what I want or else I'm going to intervene and make you. And Jones is like cowed by the threat. And that's why he does what Black wants. It's that Jones has no idea that Black would make him do this if he didn't do it on his own. So in other words, the case that Frankfurt wants you to consider is one where Black's hypothetical intervention plays absolutely no role. And
I don't know if this one is from Frankfurt or it's from someone else, but it's the one that really sticks in my mind of a Frankfurt case, and I might mess this up slightly. But the one I really know is the one where kind of the person is driving like a truck or something to like a bank robbery or whatever, and unbeknownst to them, they have like a thing in their brain which will make them take all the right turns to go to the bank, and kind of they need to take the last left turn to go to the bank, and the thing will prevent them from turning right or going straight ahead. If they chose to turn right or go straight ahead, but they choose to go left.
Yeah, I think this is John Martin Fisher, who's like a sort of later co-thinker of Frankfurt style compatibilism.
But that one for me really clearly got the idea across. Like it didn't make sense to me that person has freely chosen to do that, despite the fact that they couldn't have done otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. So this is Fisher says you're exercising guidance control as opposed to this whatever the other kind of control is that you wouldn't have, that you need to be able to turn right to have. I don't remember the phrase, but yeah. So yeah, like the kinds of the very goofy intuition pumping version that like I've often used in intro classes and that I use in the essay is, let's say Black is a dentist as well as a mad scientist. So Jones unwittingly comes in to have his wisdom teeth removed, and while he's out under the laughing gas, Black, he does take. He does take out the wisdom teeth. But he does. He also does a little impromptu brain surgery, and he puts a chip in Jones's head, and he has. And anytime Black chooses to activate the chip, it will take over Jones's brain and make him, do what Black wants him to do. And crucially, okay, so let's say, again, try to, put some flesh on the bones, like give people a specific example to think about. So, Black suggests a crime that Jones could commit. I say he could put a loaded gun in a map. People are talking about Dick Hard and dogs in the chats. Let's say a map to a playground full of puppies and small children. On the bedside table. And so one of two things will happen when Jones wakes up. One, Jones is not going to do it, in which case Black, pushes the button on his controller to activate the chip in Jones's brain, and then Jones ends up doing it anyway. Or two, Jones just does it on his own, and the chip, the existence of the chip is completely irrelevant to the chain of cause and effect that happens here. That there's that the chip is never activated. Jones never knows that there is a chip, right? The fact that the chip is there is 100% irrelevant to why Jones did what he did, and Frankfurt's point, is, man, I always wanted to massacre a playground full of children and puppies. Excellent, right? Like, what good luck that a map and a loaded gun, we're here. And then he goes off, whistling a jaunty tune and commits the massacre. And like I think intuitively we wouldn't consider the existence of the chip to be mitigating in any way. We would think that in the scenario where the chip had to be activated, then we wouldn't think Jones was responsible. We think Black was responsible, but Jones is just one of his victims. But in the scenario where the chip never had to be activated, we wouldn't think the chip had anything to do with anything. That was that we wouldn't think that even though all roads led to massacre. There's no doing otherwise in this scenario.
You should change the example to like purely be dentistry focused. So actually, the chip he inserts makes him brush his teeth twice a day.
There
And
you go.
and you know, he leaves as often happens in the dentist. He like gives him a complimentary thing of toothpaste and even a toothbrush. But of course, you know, you know, he's good with his brushing his teeth anyway, and he chooses to do it 2 times a day anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so in the brushing his teeth 3 times a day example, we would think he is no less praiseworthy because this inactive chip he doesn't know about is in his head. And in the massacring children and puppies example, we would think he's no less blameworthy because of this chip in his head that he doesn't know about, that was never activated, and that whose existence played no role whatsoever in generating his decision. And I should just parenthetically say that in this vast literature on Frankfurt cases, that like there's way more of it than you think there is. That people like tweaking these examples either to try to show that Frankfurt's actually wrong, or tweaking them to show that the people who think that Frankfurt is wrong are wrong. Frankfurt's actually right. In this massive literature, there are all these moves about, okay, well, if Jones only knows to intervene, or sorry, Black only knows to intervene when Jones has sort of showed some sign that he's not going to do what Black wants him to do, then isn't that, flicker of freedom itself doing otherwise? So then like we don't really have a counterexample to the principle of alternate possibilities. And then there are all these ways of like getting around that and saying, well, maybe there are like certain neural pathways you have to start to go down before you form the intention to not do what Black wants. And so Black can intervene when that happens. So if Black doesn't intervene, then there isn't even a flicker of freedom. So there's a whole, there's a vast literature on this. I'm not, I make no attempt to summarize in the essay because that would take it from 3,000 words to like 100,000 words. But in any case, though, what Frankfurt takes this to establish, at least, and obviously not everybody agrees, but I think that he did fundamentally change the map of the debate, because now you can't just kind of help yourself to the assumption that ability to do otherwise and the kind of free will that matters, moral responsibility, the same thing. You have to reckon with these arguments, whatever conclusion you come to. What he takes this to establish is that, okay, well, look, these two kinds of free will, freedom to do otherwise, and free will in the sense of the control condition for moral responsibility, like in the sense that you would say Jones committed that massacre of his own free will, that these are just different. And that, Frankfurt's position, or John Martin Fisher's position later, these are called semi-compatibilism, because they're willing to say, look, if by free will you mean the first thing, you mean freedom to do otherwise, then I don't know, maybe we don't have that if we're in a deterministic universe. That's the whole argument, the classical compatibilist is having. All I'm saying is whether or not we have free will in that sense, we would definitely have free will in the sense of the control condition for moral responsibility in a deterministic universe. It would definitely be the case that that sort of he committed the massacre of his own free will sense of free will, that you're in control of your actions in the right way to be morally responsible for them. We would have that anyway. And now what kind of control that would be is a whole other question. Frankfurt's own answer, which I don't find super satisfying, is, I think it's too minimalistic. It's kind of the semi-compatibilist version of the problem with Hume we were talking about before, is about higher order desires. Frankfurt thinks that, well, what matter, okay, it's not quite the Hume thing. It's not just that you're doing what you want to, that your actions line up with your desires, but they line up with your higher order desires. So you're doing what you want to do. So like the kind of example that I think one of the examples that Frankfurt thinks about is like drug addiction, that if you have and I'm realizing as I'm saying this that I forgot part of his terminology, but he had,
I think you say like you forgot how drug addiction worked.
yeah, how does it work? Like, why do people, need to stop the stream and do some experimentation. So he's got some fun term that I do not remember for an addict who just hasn't thought about it and just doesn't have any higher order desires one way or the other. They just act on their impulses, and they neither want to use it or want not to. They're just sort of immediately they're doing it like Lucy, going for the food that smells good, right?
The poison beef.
Yeah. And wanton, thank you, Daniel. Wanton is the word that I was forgetting. So the wanton addict has no higher order desires one way or the other. They're just like the same way we're all kind of, at least we all start out as wanton addicts of breathing, right? It's not that we've thought about whether we want to continue to breathe air. We just kind of, have the impulse to do it and we do it, right? So a wanton addict is just they neither want to quit or want not to quit. They just want the drugs and they use them, and that's that, right? I think maybe I think plausibly, before the information about the link between smoking and cancer was as well known, and soldiers in World War II would get cigarettes in their ration packs and all that stuff, right? I think probably a lot of people were wanton nicotine addicts in just this sense that they never.
I got cigarettes as rations in 2017.
Awesome. Well, I don't think Western militaries do that anymore, but but yeah, I suppose it's not too surprising that where you were, they would. But then then the unwilling addict is the person who wants who wants to quit, but they can't. So I'd always, when I was going over this with classes, I would always throw my friend Sutherland under the bus and, and recount being out drinking with him. And he'd be like, I'm not going to smoke any cigarettes tonight, I'm quitted. And then he'd be like, can I have a cigarette? And then he'd smoke 20 of them, but,
and yeah, it is a very curious thing for human freedom, because we think that at least some of the time, probably literally every drug addict is to some degree, desiring at some level not to be a drug addict.
Yeah, it's very, very common.
If just to get your tolerance down.
Yeah, that's true. And then the willing addict is somebody who has thought about it and
decided this is fucking sick.
Yeah, exactly. It's I always think about the movie Trainspotting. There's a line in the voiceover where he's like, "That's when we all made the healthy democratic decision, the mature decision to get back on the stuff." That's I don't know. There's a Martin Amis novel where he has this sticking with the cigarette example, where he has this really funny line about how sort of the characters justifying smoking, and they're I'm always told that every cigarette takes 2 minutes off my life, or whatever it is supposed to be. And he's like, okay, which 2 minutes would those be? Are those 2 minutes of your 20s, 2 minutes of your 30s? Or are those 2 of those really fun minutes when you at the end where you can't go to the bathroom on your own or remember your grandchildren's names? It's yeah, I think it's worth the trade. So if that's, if you have the Amos character's attitude, that's the Pregnant Widow, that's the book. then maybe you're a willing addict. And Frankfurt is going to say, well, the willing addict, he's willing to concede that they're responsible for their continued use, even though if they ever decided to quit, they would quite likely become the unwilling addict, because it's really hard to quit. But that doesn't matter, because Frankfurt doesn't believe in the principle of alternate possibilities. He thinks that all that matters is that your actions line up with your higher order desires. You want to smoke, and you want to smoke, and you are smoking, and that's what matters. Whereas the unwilling addict and the wanton addict aren't.
A strange thing that people say a lot on Reddit Ask Philosophy on this topic is around the idea that, like, they'll say that, okay, like, I can act based on my desires, but I can't do anything to affect my desires. It's like, what?
You can't.
Of course you can. Like,
that's such a weird thing to say.
People say it so much, though, that, well, it's based on whose quote is it? Schopenhauer? That man can will, but he can't will what he wills, or whatever.
Yeah. And it's like, look, there's an obvious, I mean, we could argue about whether it's the sense that matters for responsibility, but there's an obvious sense in which you can. Like, you don't have I mean, there are limits to your ability to, of course, right? Like, but as there is.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's
to will.
Like, was Schopenhauer just like saying to Aristotle was like wrong there? Because it's essential for Aristotle, like, we can desire towards certain desires.
I mean, self-reform is certainly a thing that exists. That there are people who make decisions that shape their character in the future. I think. I mean, honestly, that would be a really weird thing to think just didn't exist. It's like, oh no, nobody ever does like successful self-work. That like nobody is ever able to like mold their character in a better direction.
Ben, you just immensely triggered me, because I use the word self-work constantly in my PhD when I'm talking about privilege, and they're turned towards like the internal, like changing the inside of your brain to change institutions and politics and so on.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think it has anything to do with politics, really. I think you're not going to change the institutions that way. But you might change yourself.
Yeah, which is really nice. You are you. So
yeah, I mean, like I'm very. I don't know about you. I'm very interested in me.
Yes.
Like,
necessarily, I think.
Yeah. Even if it doesn't, even if changing me doesn't change the world, I'm still interested in what happens with me. And it seems like there are people who go and, we can take very non-privileged examples and think about people who like go through some sort of process of reform while they're serving time in prison. And there are certainly people who will go from like having incredibly poor impulse control and like constantly getting into fights with people, etc., to, whatever they go through, whatever kind of, meditation, like whatever they're doing, right? And like they, through an effort of will, come out on the other end as this different kind of person who's like much more restrained and calm and all that stuff. And that's clearly a thing that's possible. I mean, if you, again, like whether it's the thing that matters for responsibility, that's like a substantive thing you can have a philosophical argument for, but it's bizarre that anybody thinks you can't do it. I mean, that's like the weirdly popular online belief that nobody ever changes their mind because of arguments.
Yeah.
It's like,
and like,
do you really believe that?
How did you come to think that?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, you heard somebody give you reasons, and that's why you now believe that nobody changes your mind because of arguments, right? Like,
I mean, clearly that has been constantly like bullied and coerced, which is probably like how some particularly weak-willed people experience the internet.
Yeah. Well, there is some of that too, but I do tend to think that even the most like wretched internet creature sometimes changes his mind because of arguments. Like that's not something that like literally, like I would actually be fascinated to meet a human being who never changed their mind because of arguments.
Well, I mean, you met your niece.
Nephew, but yeah, fair enough. I would be fascinated to meet an adult human being who never changed their mind because of arguments.
Do you want to have a go on randomly connecting this to Marxism before we stop?
Yeah. Okay. So Daniel in the chat says this might be interesting per the channel, but you could connect this to Marxist arguments and ideology and false consciousness. See, John Elster did just this. Would love to hear Ben's thoughts. Do you want to start with this one? Because I'm not sure off the top of my head how to connect, what to say in terms of connecting those topics.
No, I mean, I was trying to pass to you because I wasn't really sure myself. But obviously, there is some kind of connection here, right?
Yeah.
And people will try and say that Marx is an incompatibilist, but clearly, from what I think of what he said on human freedom and so on, he's very clearly some kind of compatibilist. Obviously, he might not fit into kind of contemporary analytic definitions.
Sure.
And obviously, yeah, like I think the drug addiction example, also has something to do with kind of false consciousness and so on. And like, I mean, because one worry we have with kind of, higher order desires is, what makes them high, apart from, I guess, the relationship to another desire. But like,
yeah, it's so it's like a first order desire. It is a desire to do something, right? A second.
I feel like people might be able to say, well, okay, but why are we worrying about those desires? Are they not like the weak, pathetic brothers who don't actually do anything? While it's on the first order desires that we actually normally do stuff regardless of our kind of attitude towards these desires.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like the one thing I always want to say when the subject of false consciousness comes up is that people seem to have this impression that this is like some sort of central concept for Marx in a way that's like really not true, just textually. In fact, I think Marx never says false consciousness. Engels does, but like even Engels isn't saying it in like Anti-Düring or something, some like major theoretical work. I think it's literally from a letter from Engels.
Right. Yeah. I think kind of it's been taken up in like bourgeois high school sociology classes because it does more fit with kind of bourgeois conceptions of what goes on in society, where you move away from like the direct kind of blood and iron and steel relations of production.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a way, I think the reason that this, again, I think it's like a phrase that's plucked from one of Engels' letters, but the reason people ran with it so much in the 20th century is because it's like an answer to this question about roughly.
It's what the kids call a cope.
Yeah, exactly. Why hasn't the revolution happened? Right? Why is it that the workers of the world haven't united and gotten rid of capitalism? And so the answer to that question is, they must not understand what their interests are. They must be in the grips of false consciousness. And I think that I want to be careful about this because I don't want to suggest that I think that people are like perfectly rational and aren't influenced by any sort of ideology and et cetera, because I'm obviously not, right? But I think that the idea that you need to bring in some heavy duty idea of false consciousness to do the heavy lifting here, I think might be kind of misguided. So Vivek Chibber wrote a book called The Class Matrix that gets into this, and even like G.A. Cohen in his book Karl Marx's Theory of History, there's like a paragraph where I think he kind of anticipates some of the things that Chibber says about this, where Cohen is like, look, and I think he's talking about like, I don't know, Marcuse and stuff like that. It's like, and he's very sort of polite and Oxfordy about it. He's like, there's probably something to this, but like you don't. But he says, look, it's not as if Marxists expected the revolution was going to happen on any random Wednesday, that like the thought was always that it had to do with like, it was like when like severe crises of the existing system would lead to this, because I think that you don't actually have to bring in like it's, so I interviewed Chipper about this on GTAA, and he said, like his sort of funny way of like deriding like false consciousness theory is like, oh, people just drank the Kool-Aid, right? That's your explanation. They drank the Kool-Aid. And it's like, well, look, you don't really have to postulate that people drank the Kool-Aid. You can just say interests are complicated, right? That there's, even though there is a sense in which the collective class interest, the working class, is in, uniting with the rest of, and
right. I mean, unless everyone else also chooses to be a communist, you being a communist is not good for you normally.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are very rational reasons in terms of people's actual interests why people are reluctant to like join union organizing drives in like the coffee shop where they work. Never mind take this flying leap into the unknown by overthrowing the existing means of existing.
Right, yeah, because it turns out that we live in the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and they can just blackball you.
Yeah, exactly, right. So I think that I wouldn't say ideology plays no role, but I think that the sort of starring role that it's assigned might miss a lot of points, and that there's I think people's individual interests are complicated. I think that the whole sort of task of organizing is to find ways to appeal to those individual interests in order to build collective solidarity, but that's really hard, and I think it's maybe not that surprising and in need of explanation that it's really, really difficult to get a critical mass of people to resist capitalism in the ways that you need to, and like the circumstances might kind of have to be just
well,
right.
And also, as you've written and are more enthusiastic about as I am, even when this has happened, it hasn't necessarily turned out very well in the end.
It's also certainly true, right? As the you always have to use the Stalinist passive voice for this. Mistakes were made.
The means of production weren't spinning fast enough, it turned out.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are both sort of. I mean, I think that our friend Steve Paxton has a book called Unlearning Marx, where he does, I think, make the very reasonable point that definitely captures part of that story, that it not being the case that you can jump straight from a decaying semi-feudal, mostly agricultural empire to a flourishing socialism doesn't actually contradict the Marxist theory of history. It vindicates the Marxist theory of history. Like, this is exactly.
Whenever I think about the more I think about the USSR, I'm constantly amazed about how well it turned out.
Yeah, right. Like, I think there are a lot of reasons to think it would have actually gone much worse than it did.
And Stalin shot a lot of people. But if you apart from kind of bad famine luck, and the fact that which is partially caused by kind of outside forces, compare that. It's really incredible that they managed to go through 150 years of capitalism in 15 years and probably kill a lot less people than were killed in Britain during the same period, where the average life expectancy of a worker in a heavy dust factory making pottery or something was 18 months to 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, even Tony Cliff, who's one of the Marxist writers who's the least sympathetic to the Soviet Union, he wrote a book called the title under which it's best known now is State Capitalism in Russia, and he even makes this point there. He says, look, the first couple 5-year plans were basically these centuries of bloodshed and awfulness of the Industrial Revolution in England, condensed into about 10 years, and that's kind of how it played out. I mean, I think that so I definitely think that the Steve Paxton point is important. It definitely captures part of what should be said here. I also do think, though, that there's that I don't want to sort of fob it all off on objective conditions. I think that
I love to fob it all off on objective conditions. It's my favorite thing to do, which is funny because I'm such a believer in free will.
fair enough. You contain multitudes. Yeah. So yeah. I mean, I think that there's. I think that we should be able to look at those societies and say, like, now that especially we've got a little bit of historical distance from them, for the most part, that and be able to say, hey, here's the stuff that went well, great. Maybe you can replicate that in a better version of the future, and here are the many negative lessons, and you can learn from that. And I don't know, what's that quote from at the beginning of Zizek's in defense of lost causes. It's like this, the William Morris quote, I think, try, fail, try again, fail better. That's that's capitalism is still really awful, and there's still good reason to want to pursue radical change, and you probably shouldn't recreate exactly what happened the first time, or it's gonna go or it's gonna go just as badly again. But that's I'll I don't know, or
rip Harry Frankfurt.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think and this is actually to finally, I know we've just been off for the last 15 minutes or whatever on this seemingly completely unrelated tangent about Marxism, but
I mean, presumably the audience enjoys that more than all the products we talked about earlier.
Well, just to briefly connect the two subjects, you said earlier you thought Marx is some kind of compatibilist, and he might be. I mean, at the very least, I think that whether or not he is exactly, I think.
Right. I mean, he didn't necessarily have a strong reason to believe that the whole universe was deterministic to even kind of worry about the problem of compatibilism in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that Marx necessarily has a take on that one way or the other, but what I do think, and this is what I say at the end of the essay, is that
it's often true.
For people who are listening to this later as a podcast, Jordan's chat was going to try "It's Not You, It's Objective Conditions" for my next breakup. Yeah, it is often true. So yeah, I think just to briefly connect the two subjects, the essay is basically an appreciation of some really important arguments that this guy made that really changed the shape of the debate about this stuff. And he actually did write a little bit about political philosophy that I don't like. We can do that some other week. But I do think that there's, to the extent that this, I don't think philosophy needs to earn its keep by being politically relevant all the time. I think that it's like a worthwhile human activity in itself, whether it's politically relevant or not. I want to create a society where people have much more leisure time to think about this shit. But I do actually think this one is politically relevant because, whether or not Marx is a compatibilist, or maybe he's, maybe he just doesn't have a take one way or the other on compatibilism versus incompatibilism. I think a lot of what Marx does care about is much harder to make sense of if you don't believe in a sort of baseline human dignity and autonomy that we're capable of making like meaningfully autonomous decisions. Because if you sort of obviously this is a much larger thing. We've talked about this before, but I think if you think of people as fleshy robots who are aren't really agents in that way. They're not really making meaningfully autonomous decisions. They're just kind of they're just kind of vessels of good and bad consequences. But it's not, and maybe they'll be happier if they think that they're making their own decisions or whatever. But that's it, right? I think that's a view that is at least an awkward fit with the level of importance that somebody like Marx is going to assign to human freedom in the political sense and the sort of larger sense that it's really important that we create a kind of society that frees people up to sort of pursue their own projects in their own way and and not have to be subordinated all the time to the relentless imperatives of economic accumulation. I think that so in that sense, whether even even if the man was not a comrade, I do think that the stuff that he was working on is actually congenial to a left project. And there we go. I've rendered the last half an hour not completely irrelevant to the rest of the discussion.
Cool. Well, let's go then. Wait, what are you doing next week? What are we doing next week?
Yeah. So next week is going to. We are actually going to be back on Marx stuff in 2 weeks, but yeah, that's not coming up till Sunday after next. Next week is going to sort of be about metaphysics in general and sort of whether thinking about some of the topics that we've been covering recently about possible worlds, about time, in a way, some of this free will stuff, like that, the sort of objection to all of that I find very understandable that somebody could have, which is essentially the "how the fuck would you know" objection, that there's something just sort of fundamentally ridiculous about trying to figure out basic things about reality in this way. That like whatever we can figure out about external reality is I don't know, maybe kind of leave that to science, but otherwise all of this stuff, that there's something just sort of absurd about trying to engage with these kinds of metaphysical arguments. And this actually started out as a digression, not for this week, but for last week, that I had to cut to stay down to 3,000 words. And then I realized this should be its own essay.
I'm planning on doing a flip then for that, where I say that people who say that are actually being kind of like idealists about the mind, because obviously looking inside the structure of our mind is reflected. Our minds are created by the world, and because our minds are in the world, by reflecting the inner structure of the world of our minds, we can learn facts about the world and broader structures and that, which I think is like Kantian shit.
That is kind of Kantian, yeah. All right, well, sounds good.
See you then, friends.